George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
The NATO-backed Kiev regime bombs the center of Moscow. What could possibly go wrong? And Barack Obama appears in public at a luxury tennis club not 48 hours after the death of the second of his personal chefs, sporting a black eye and plasters on his fingers. Who was the other paddle boarder? Was it Barack? Was it Michael? Or was it their daughter? We want to know. And the circus in Washington continues tomorrow as the business partner of Hunter Biden prepares to tell all, although the Department of Justice seeks to arrest him to prevent him giving evidence to a congressional committee. I'm not making any of that up. Meanwhile, African leaders in profusion gathered in StPetersburg to get pictures taken with President Putin. And the president of Niger is overthrown and charged with corruption. The new leadership in that uranium-rich country is being threatened by Blinken and Macron, the little Bourbon. What could possibly go wrong in that case either? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night, as Betty Davis once said. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Global warming, take a look at that picture of central London. Look out your window if you're in Britain as they tell us about this baking hot summer in the United Kingdom. Not likely, according to the vast majority of British people. We in the Workers' Party have demanded a referendum in Britain on whether or not to continue the commitment to a net zero economy by 2050. And the signs are that everyone from Lawrence Fox and Tony Blair are backing the central demand of ours, that this net zero scam will basically condemn the British economy and British people to a cold penury for no good reason. And that's why I'm running this poll this evening. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? You can answer yes or no on my Twitter, on my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway, on the YouTube community poll, and on the YouTube stream that many of you are watching now. If you haven't yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so. And like the show, if indeed you do like it. And I'm confident that you're going to like it tonight. We have a panel almost like no other. And we have pretty good panels. Well, the Kiev regime has landed bombs on the financial district in the center of Moscow. As Ambassador Craig Murray put it on Twitter just a few minutes ago, whilst that may be legal, it's definitely not wise, and the Russian response is likely to be very robust indeed. In the last 48 hours, the Kiev regime has bombed a museum and coffee shop in Rostov, and now landing drones, explosive, suicide kamikaze drones in the center of Moscow. It will not be long before we see the Russian response. The much vaunted Ukrainian counter-offensive, first designated for the spring and then the summer, hasn't really got off the ground. So a resort to spectacular acts of what many would call individual acts of terrorism is the next, perhaps the last, throw of the dice for the Kiev regime. But the course of the war now seems set, and its ending will either be at a negotiated table or it will be on the battlefield. Either way, it will not stop, I am sure, until the aims of the special military operation have been achieved. And those aims, of course, have expanded as the atrocity, like the one committed in Moscow in the last few hours, continue to rain down. If the special military operation had stopped when it could have stopped just a month or two into it, if it was not scuppered by Boris Johnson at the behest of Joe Biden, then the terms of the settlement might have been entirely palatable for the vast majority of Ukrainian citizens. Now, after 522 days, the terms of the settlement will be much more condign and will surely include the liberation of Odessa, the landlocking of the stump state of Western Ukraine by the taking of the entire southern Black Sea coastline of Ukraine, and the liberation of the ethnically Russian people of Transnistria. And that includes the Russian jewel of Odessa. Odessa is a very fascinating place. I've been studying it quite substantially just in the last few days. You know that in 1941, when the Nazi and Romanian armed forces occupied Odessa as part of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, there were more than 150,000 Jews living in Odessa. It was a Russian Jewish city. By the time the Red Army liberated Odessa in 1944, there were fewer than 5,000 Jews left in the city. I don't need to spell out to you what happened to all the others. In fact, this lash-up of Japan and Germany and Italy and Romania in this current war against Russia is so redolent of historic significance. It is amazing that not a single commentator, academic, still less member of the British Parliament or any of the other parliaments in Western Europe at least, can even bring themselves to comment on it. The idea that Russia is now confronted with precisely the same state alliance, axis we used to call it, is so obscene, so grotesque, you would have thought that it would have entered the discourse of any sensible person, considering the potential course and outcome of this war in Ukraine. But it does not. Romania is now one of the principal bases for the NATO attack on Russia, which is clearly intending to break up, to balkanize, to fragment the Russian Federation. Nobody mentions that it was the German Reich with their Romanian allies who committed such atrocities in the Holocaust in the East. But then, how could they mention it? How could we justify recreating the axis that caused the deaths of 26 million people in Russia and the wider Soviet Union in the years 1941 to 1945? Best that we sweep that under the carpet. Well, Russia will respond, I've no doubt, to the Rostov and Moscow attacks, maybe even while we are on the air. And if they do, we'll bring these developments to you. But let me turn my attention to Washington. The circus around the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden affair sure ain't funny. It's true there are many clowns in play in that circus, but the story they are bringing us is dark indeed. Just ponder this. Why did Barack Obama allow Joe Biden complete control over America's Ukraine policy when he was the vice president? Unless there are no intelligence services in the United States, they must have known and told President Obama everything that Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family were doing in Ukraine. But Barack Obama allowed it to continue. And what has it now brought us? It has brought us the corruption, final corruption of the American Republic itself. The Russiagate hoax, which was in part predicated on the United States' deceitful entanglement in Ukraine. The impeachment of President Trump for demanding answers to what the Bidens were doing in Ukraine. The corruption of the American justice system that we have seen played out this week in the attempt to hoodwink a federal judge into granting immunity to Hunter Biden, into crimes far more serious than the ones that he intended to plead guilty to. The corruption of the First Amendment of the American Constitution. They would not have had to corrupt the social media companies. They didn't have to do much work to do so. It's true. The door was open. But they corrupted the First Amendment of the American Constitution itself by a state corporate lash-up to conspire against the freedom of speech, thought, even assembly of the American people, guaranteed under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And not only has it begotten this total corruption of American democracy, it has begotten a war with the Russian Federation, which could turn out to be World War III, all to cover up Joe Biden's crimes in the Ukraine, all to cover up the corrupt nexus of the Biden crime family, the Ukrainian oligarchs, and the succession of Ukrainian puppet politicians. It doesn't get much more serious than all of that. It's a big question why the American public are putting up with that. But it's a bigger question why the European governments on our behalf are going along with it. It's one thing, your sons dying for Kupiansk and what side of the line it's going to be. It's another thing doing so under the leadership of Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, a collection of gerontocratic leaders that make Chernenko and Brezhnev look like mere striplings. People who have mental health episodes on screen at a press conference are leading the governments of the once proud continent of Europe over a cliff for American interests, self-harming, maybe even committing economic and political suicide in our own countries to follow the diktat of Joe Biden. Meanwhile, Russia and China, for that matter, are going from strength to strength. They are demonstrating daily the tectonic shift in the plates. They are demonstrating daily the new friends and the consolidation of old with new friends that are lining up alongside them. Putin called an Africa summit in StPetersburg this week. It was attended by 49 countries, heads of state, deputy heads of state. Thousands of delegates from Africa were in Russia. They weren't in London, and they certainly weren't in Paris, about which more in a moment. When President Putin reeled off the list of African heroes, Patrice Lumumba, Kenneth Kaunda, Joseph Nyerere, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, he was rolling off a list. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, he was rolling off a list of Russia's closest historical allies on the continent of Africa. People that Russia supported and the West murdered or overthrew, subverted, conspired against, destroyed. Do you see where I'm going here? These old friends of Russia are joined by new friends, like the magnificent 35-year-old president of Burkina Faso, a man so powerful and eloquent and handsome. Well, he made Mitch McConnell look, well, like a fossil. And when the president of Burkina Faso said no one should pity a slave who does not rebel, this resounded through the African continent. And he called on the African countries to have some dignity, to stand up for themselves and to stand with those countries that stood with them, rather than the countries that did everything they could to enslave, enchain, and bind forever in economic slavery the countries of Africa. And the African people overwhelmingly believe that. And no sooner was the summit ended, but a case in point was demonstrated. The corrupt puppet regime in Niger, uranium-rich Niger, was overthrown by a movement of its own people and its own armed forces. Nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with the United States. Nothing to do with France. 80% of every light in Paris this evening is lit by the resources of the people of Niger. But only 20% of the people of Niger have even got electricity. You'd think the French would be too embarrassed to comment. But they're not just commenting. Little Macron, I was going to call him Little Napoleon, but he doesn't deserve to be in the same sentence as Napoleon. Little Macron has threatened the people of Niger to reinstate their puppet president so he can continue to loot the country in the interests of France. And Antony Blinken has backed him. Antony Blinken demanded the reinstatement of the corrupt puppet president of Niger. I mean, I don't want to swear on air, but who is Antony Blinken to decide who rules Niger? And if you were in any doubt as to whose benefit and disbenefit this overthrow of the Niger government might be, you already know the answer in the attitude of France and the attitude of the United States to the coup. So I know nothing about the new leadership in Niger, but they're all right by me if they can make Macron and Blinken so very, very angry. We'll be talking about these shifting tectonic plates and about one of the most surprising turns of events, the coming of North Korea, the DPRK, and its leader Kim Jong-un in from the cold. You never thought you'd hear me say that, did you? Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows. Let me say that you can listen to the audio-only version of MOATS on our MOATS podcast, and the numbers on that are going through the roof. Just search MOATS with George Galloway on Apple, Spotify, Google, or whichever platform you listen to your podcasts on. In recent weeks, it's been the #1 political podcast in Benin, Jordan, the Gambia, Qatar, Jamaica, Ghana, Iceland, Malaysia, Singapore, Sweden, and the Philippines. #1 political podcast in all those countries. Truly, truly phenomenal. Do you know that BBC News has lost 40% of its audience in the last 2 years? It's official. And of course, that is the sensible thing to do. But to get people to tune in and change course and listen to a radically different point of view is even more difficult. But it's happening. And the numbers that we are racking up are now in their millions.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Please vote in this poll. I want it to be the biggest poll possible. It's overwhelming, the result, and just shows that under the ice of the catastrophic, apocalyptic propaganda around the issue of global warming, the public, when asked, have a different point of view. And we are determined to win this referendum on net zero 2050. And if you vote tonight, that will help us make the case for a referendum. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? You can answer yes or no on Telegram, on Twitter, which is, I'm told, now called X, on the YouTube community stream, and on the YouTube stream. Now, Dr. George Szamuely is the premier academic in the eastern part of Europe, the central part of Europe, and one of our most popular guests. He's never once been on here without imparting wisdom that was precious as well as popular. And it's a great privilege to welcome him back onto the mother of all talk shows again. Dr. George, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the dramatic developments in Moscow. What could possibly go wrong now that Kiev is landing bombs in the center of Moscow?
Well, what indeed? Well, obviously, Ukraine is desperate for escalating this war, because ultimately the only way it can hope to prevail is through U.S. military intervention. And so that's obviously what it's going for as it launches these attacks on Moscow or wherever. It's clearly hoping for some kind of a major escalation on Russia's part that could provoke Washington to do something. I don't think that would work. However, there is a real danger that Washington could yet be provoked into getting directly involved. I don't think it's so much the sort of terrorist attacks on Russian cities, but more through the activities of Poland. Poland has become the rabid dog of Europe and is very anxious to provoke some kind of an incident with Russia in the hope of, again, triggering NATO's famous Article 5. So an attack on Poland is an attack on all, and therefore everyone must go to war on Poland's behalf. So I think that's probably at the moment where the greatest danger lies in terms of direct NATO intervention.
Let me detain you on that point. It is one of the greatest historical ironies, is it not, that the Banderaite regime in Kiev, which collaborated, Bandera was the right-hand man of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, who massacred well over 1 million people in the Holocaust of the East. Many of them, most of them, Polish. That the Polish government is now in double harness with the supporters of, the descendants of, those who mass murdered Poles. How's that for an axis?
It is an extraordinary event because, of course, as you say, the massacres in Volhynia were absolutely horrific. But the strange thing about Poland, and I don't claim to be, to understand this wholly, is that the Polish hatred towards Russia is far more intense than its hatred towards Germany. I mean, it does hate the Germans, but nothing to the extent that it hates the Russians. And by the same token, it doesn't hate the Ukrainians anything with the intensity that it hates the Russians. Now, one should also say that the Poles treated the Ukrainians very badly during the late 1930s, during the forced Polonization campaign. I mean, Poland seized this territory from Russia in 1919, 1920, while Russia was absolutely preoccupied with the Civil War. So Russia was forced to sign this agreement, the Treaty of Riga, 1921. So Poland grabbed itself a big chunk of territory and treated the inhabitants very badly, which I think contributed to the subsequent bad treatment that was meted out to the Poles. But nonetheless, the extraordinary thing is that Poland has this animus towards Russia, and then Putin pointed out correctly is that yes, Poland lost some territory in the east, but it was more than compensated by huge rewards of territory in the west, the parts of East Prussia and West Prussia and so on. So Poland should be rather grateful to the Soviet Union for essentially restoring a big country after World War II, not to mention the fact that the Soviet Union liberated Poland from Nazism. But nonetheless, the Poles absolutely loathe the Russians with an intensity far greater than the Germans, the ones who actually enslaved Poland. It's a mystery, and I don't fully understand it myself.
I attended an event in Poland, in Warsaw, in the last day or so, and it became clear to me that there are actually rather a lot of Polish people who don't approve of their country being dragooned, and it's willingly being dragooned by the political leaders, into being the spearhead against Russia. They think that no good can come of it. And moreover, there's a real fear that martial law will be declared in Poland, at least in part of Poland, and that will be used to cancel the upcoming elections in the country. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's a distinct possibility because Poland right now is whipping up an extraordinary fervor against Russia. It's pretty much like they're moving onto a war footing. They've escalated their military spending. It's, I think, something like 5% of GDP, so well over what anyone demanded of NATO. It's getting all of its arms from the United States, so it's not even bothering with the EU defense industry. And they've told the United States that we are your strongest, your most loyal ally in Europe. Forget old Europe, forget Germany, forget France. They're weak, insipid, decadent. They did all these terrible deals with Putin. We are the strongest, we are the most vigorous part of Europe, and we will be, your foot soldiers in the coming war against Russia. It's an extraordinarily belligerent rhetoric that's coming out of Warsaw. But You're right. I mean, I talk to Poles as well who are very sensible, very reasonable, who don't want to get dragged into the stupid war. But Poland's leaders are not like that. So it's whether it's Donald Tusk or whether it's Radek Sikorski or whether it's Morawiecki, I mean, or Kaczynski, the leaders, they are all absolutely demented in their anti-Russian hatred.
Now, leaving aside the Eastern European theatre for a moment, though, I'd like to come back to it. These were extraordinary scenes in St. Petersburg over the last few days, weren't they? No one could have expected this African renaissance to be picking up the momentum that it has, and the closeness of African countries now to Russia and China is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting that Putin brought up the names that you mentioned, Ben Bella, Nasser, Nkrumah, Lumumba, Samora Machel. And he actually said that, well, the Soviet Union did a great deal to liberate the peoples of Africa, a great deal to fight against colonialism, neo-colonialism, great deal to fight against apartheid. And then he said, at the time, this wasn't really that popular a policy within the Soviet Union, because people were feeling, well, why are you giving all this stuff to Africans? Well, we could use some of this ourselves. But then he says, well, actually, the Soviet Union made a very sound investment, because now, years, decades later, these Africans come to us and they are very grateful to us and are very well disposed towards us, and want to help us precisely because of that long record of Soviet assistance to Africa during those decades. And it's very interesting that Gorbachev, who kind of tossed away the Soviet Union, the Soviet legacy, and everything, over a kind of a boozy lunch with Helmut Kohl, didn't really realize he had so absorbed the Western view of the Soviet Union, he didn't realize that for much of the rest of the world, they didn't see the Soviet Union in the same way. They didn't see it in this sort of communism, anti-communism paradigm. They saw the Soviet Union as a positive force. And I think Gorbachev and the people around it didn't realize that by tossing away the Soviet legacy, they actually did a lot of harm, a lot of damage to the rest of the world. And this was a point emphasized by the president of Eritrea, who gave a very long presentation in front of Putin, and was very critical of Gorbachev and the Soviet leaders around him, that you tossed all this aside and you left us in the lurch. We looked to you for assistance and you left us in the lurch, and that maybe Russia now is actually coming back to that the Soviet tradition of assistance to the African people.
Well, the Russians are back, but the French are on their way out. I was looking at a map today of the African countries that have literally kicked France out. And now Macron is threatening war. And as we speak, the French embassy in Niger is on fire.
Yep. Yes, it's very interesting. And it's interesting how the Western media presented it, because the Western media declared that, this African summit in St. Petersburg is a big flop because only 21 heads of state showed up. It doesn't really matter because everybody showed up. I mean, there was no one, if the West had had its way, no one would have showed up. In fact, everybody showed up to the summit. But at the same time, the media have to acknowledge that one after another, the African countries are getting rid of the so-called pro-Western regimes, and they're replacing them with governments that are hostile to France, hostile to the United States, and well disposed towards Russia. So it's we're talking about Niger, but what about Mali? That also had a change of government recently. Burkina Faso, Chad. It's a whole series of them, and in Sudan, it's a clean sweep across Western and Central Africa. and these so-called pro-Western regimes are being thrown aside. But let's remember, a lot of it is also the consequence of the Western intervention in Libya, which completely destabilized the region, unleashed Islamic terrorists. So the whole Sahel region was destroyed as a result of that, the attack on Gaddafi. And then we had this, war against Islamists. And as usual, the Americans come in. They don't really do anything. They just simply take the country over, pretend that they're fighting against Islamists. And essentially, these governments have now said, we've had enough. You're not actually doing anything. You're actually weakening us every day. We're losing this war against the Islamists. You need to go, stop giving us this assistance. We can actually do a much better job against Islamic terrorism without United States and without France. And I think that's really what's contributed to this clean sweep of regimes that have fallen in the last few months.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Doctor, let me go back to the European theatre. There's intense speculation about the Wagner Group, about Prigozhin, who turned up at the St. Petersburg summit, interestingly, and his forces, which are now in Belarus. There's speculation about Russian-Belarusian creation of a corridor to Russian territory that is effectively separated by a land corridor. I think it's the Suwalki corridor they are talking about, to reinforce it, to guard it. And equally, going back to Poland and your earlier point, there's intense speculation that the Polish army will enter Western Ukraine. That would be an act of war against Belarus and Russia, would it not?
Yes, no question. I mean, Poland is now kicking up a huge fuss about the Wagner Group and the Suwalki corridor, and that somehow there's a threat from the Wagner Group to enter Poland. So that could certainly be a danger. I mean, Poland could certainly attack Belarus, saying, "Hey, we're under threat from the Wagner Group." So I think that there's no question that that's, again, one of the possible ways in which this could escalate into World War III. The Western Ukraine is certainly a possibility if Poland and Ukraine forge some kind of a political union, and I think that's much more likely than just Poland entering unilaterally. But they've already talked in the past about creating some kind of a union state. And then if they do actually create some sort of a confederation of Poland and Ukraine, then of course Poland can enter Ukraine. And again, that could well be a trigger for World War III. This is clearly the plan. I mean, we know that Poland and Ukraine are working in tandem to escalate this into an Article 5 situation. I mean, it happened that time with the so-called missile that landed in Poland. Remember, Poland and Ukraine both proclaimed that this was an attack on Polish territory when they knew perfectly well that it wasn't. So it wasn't just Ukraine saying it. Poland also said we were under attack from Russia. So Poland and Ukraine are in on it together. But again, I think there's a real possibility that Poland and Ukraine will work out some sort of a confederation, and that in effect makes Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. So I think that's a real possibility. The Wagner Group, however, I mean, the fact that Prigozhin was at this St. Petersburg summit, well, the Wagner Group is, unlike the American, actually gets the job done in Africa. They have been far more effective in defeating ISIS than the Americans. I mean, the Americans in Africa, as in Syria, they actually don't do anything. They don't actually fight the Islamists. They actually just simply occupy territory, undermine, destabilize governments, but they don't actually get the job done of fighting the Islamists. The Wagner Group did do that, which is, I think, why, again, many of these African leaders are well disposed towards the Wagner Group.
Well, you and I have talked about Article 5 before. It doesn't actually mean what most commentators pretend that it means. But in the case of Poland entering, into Ukraine, that definitely wouldn't trigger Article 5. Because if Russia fought Poland in Western Ukraine, it's not fighting Poland, which is a member of NATO. It's fighting this new Hydra-headed entity that may or may not be formed between Poland and Western Ukraine.
No, there are all sorts of ways in which Poland is going to try and get around it and say, well, this involves Article 5. But as you say, Article 5 does not oblige everyone to go to war. Should a state come under attack, it just simply obliges all NATO member states to decide what, if anything, they're willing to do about it. But more important than Article 5 is Article 1. Article 1 obliges every NATO member state to resolve all issues with non-NATO member states by exclusively peaceful means. Article 1 supersedes Article 5. Well, Poland hasn't remotely sought to resolve its conflicts with Russia, a non-NATO member state, by peaceful means. And on the contrary, Poland has gone out of its way to provoke a war with Russia. So there's no way that Poland can try and invoke Article 5. We're under attack. We weren't doing nothing, so please come and help us. There's just no way that Poland can make that case.
Dr. George, quite brilliant as always. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? You have your say, yes or no. I've got to tell you that so far it is 92 yes, 85 yes, 91 yes, and 90 yes. 12,363 people have voted. If you've got a point of view, please register it on our poll right now. Quick break, and then I'll be right back. You don't get to call me far right. You don't get to call me that on my own show. A lifelong socialist, the leader of a socialist party, the Workers' Party of Britain, with an Indonesian wife, with 5 mixed-race children, with a record of fighting racism all of my life, representing more people of colour in the British Parliament than anyone in history by a country mile. You don't get to call me far right. These kind of idiotic insults tossed around by infantile leftists who think that anyone to the right of them is a fascist, is a racist. They are the cause of the crashing and burning of what used to be called the left. They are the cause of it. They have discredited leftism with their foolish, idiotic isms and ists and smears that emanate from them like a bad smell.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
If you are in the UK or Ireland and want to have your say on anything in the show, it's 08 08196 5522. That's 08 08196 5522. It's entirely free of charge. Ditto in the US and Canada, where the number is +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. And if you are in the rest of the world, which is most of you to be fair, it's 44 203 966 2625. That's +44 203 966 2625. Let's hit the phone lines. David is in England, in Swindon. but wants to talk about Niger. David, most welcome. Go ahead.
Yeah, you stole my thunder because I phoned at 7:05 to speak about Niger, and you've already taken my thunder. But yeah, I was listening to the radio this afternoon on the way home, and Niger come up, and Anthony Blinken's name, and I thought, well, that's trouble. And he said that he's going to withdraw all the aid and all the subsidies, so are the French, and so is Rishi Sunak. And I didn't know anything about Niger, so I looked it up, and lo and behold, when they had their coup and took over, they're waving Russian flags. They want the French and the Americans out, just like you said. So that, the Americans have done it themselves again. It's just incredible.
Yeah,
I don't know anything about this.
It's just another symptom. Yeah, I mean, Niger is an important country. You may recall, if you're of a certain age, that they used Niger as one of the reasons for the Iraq War, with an entirely fraudulent, forged set of documents which purported to show that Saddam Hussein's government had tried to buy uranium from Niger for the purposes of the development of nuclear weapons. It was all a lie. It was entirely fake. It was a forgery. And they've always used Niger as a plaything to loot of its precious and extremely valuable uranium reserves. It's one of, next to Kazakhstan, I think it is the second most significant exporter of uranium in the entire world. So France and the United States, who have monopolized the trade with Niger, are feeling extremely put out. Well, good for the people of Niger, I say. I saw a video of the corrupt finance minister of the deposed government crying into the camera. He's been given 48 hours to explain all the money looted from Niger by the corrupt regime or face execution by firing squad. Our governments better hope that that sort of approach doesn't catch on. Last word to you, Dave.
Yeah, just on our friend Anthony Blinken, you and I love him. He also said in the White House briefing that, let me get this right, Ukraine had taken back 50% of the territory that Russia had got. Absolute rubbish. And that was in the Wall Street Journal on the 23rd of July.
Yeah.
It cannot be.
I did speak about that a couple of episodes ago. Mathematics is plainly not his strong point. But when Blinken said that US aid will now be suspended, first of all, they're not giving much aid. They're looting Niger. But secondly, the new authorities in Niger said, keep your aid and spend it on your own homeless, hungry, drug-addled people at home instead. This is a new mentality that is breaking out everywhere, not just in Africa, but I'm particularly pleased to see it there. David, thanks for the call. Michael is in Dublin. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you for having me on again, George. I want to come on and say how sickened I am to see Georgia Maloney, and she's not Irish now. You would think that by accident that she might be Irish. No, she's the Prime Minister of Italy, and she was in the White House bowing down in front of Joe Biden. Now, when she was running for election there back in 22, she was absolutely smeared by the Western press, and she was one of the most popular people out. The crowd she had supporting her, and the Italian people put a huge hope in her and what she was going to do. She would distance herself from the West, and then all of a sudden, she is the most ardent supporter of the sanctions against against Russia. I mean, and this goes against her previous positions. Did you ever see somebody do such a U-turn? Even Mrs. Thatcher refused to do a U-turn like that.
Often. The answer, Michael, is often. I'm afraid, with the exception of Orban in power and Le Pen not yet at least, in power. All of these right-wing populists are all mouth and no trousers. They are keen to beat the culture war drums, but they have absolutely no difference in their economic policy, which is neoliberal, and in their foreign policy, which is neocon. No difference from the people that they purport to hate on all other matters. They want to fight culture wars, but they also want to keep fighting NATO wars. They want to appeal to the mass of the people, but they want to have an economic system which continues to exploit the mass of the people in the interests of the few. I'm afraid, all mouth, no trousers, Georgia Meloni. Thank you, Michael, for that. Here's an email from Tony. The US Abrams and UK Challenger 2 tanks are nowhere to be seen. Both governments are desperate to keep these tanks away from the front lines. NATO equipment burns well in Ukraine. Indeed, it does. But there's a legend on the line. Let's go to him. It's Simon in Florida. Simon, nice to see you again. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Well, thank you ever so much for your coverage of the Africa-AU summit. And I would like to draw people's attention also to the speech by the President of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, who equated foreign ownership of mineral resources in Africa as the equivalent of historical slavery, and pointed out that it was China and Russia that were helping African nations not only build their own processing plants, but also their own factories in order that they could export finished goods. And I'm sure that statement greatly came to the shock of many American and European mining conglomerates. But it's worth noting that this scheme not only took colonial form during the 19th and 20th century, but was also expressed very clearly, and I would strongly encourage the audience, and I'm sure you're intimately familiar with this document, written by the famous Henry Kissinger, who was recently celebrating his 100th birthday in China, as you mentioned most recently. He was also involved with what was called National Security Memorandum 200, the full contents of which can be found at the Schiller Institute. That was the 1974 plan for African and Asian genocide through the tool of food control, war, and population reduction by the forced use of birth control. And I know it sounds quite extraordinary. It's actually a 200-page document, and it wasn't just some crazy scheme written by some white ivory tower think tank. It was actually adopted as national policy by Gerald Ford in November of 1975, and the two men that were put in charge of implementing it were Brent Scowcroft and the CIA director at the time, who was later to become President Bush of the United States. And one of the 13 countries that was specifically listed in that document was your adopted home country of Indonesia, which just this week has now tied itself most clearly to the People's Republic of China at the Chengdu Games by firmly embracing the global civilizational initiative, the global security initiative, the global defense initiative, and in October celebrating the completion of the railway line, Chinese financed and built, from Jakarta to Bandung, which will mark the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiatives, as China and Pakistan celebrate the 10th anniversary of their China-Pakistan economic corridor. And whilst we're talking about anniversaries, it's worth remembering that today is the anniversary of the second Qana massacre committed by the Israeli Air Force in the town of Qana in southern Lebanon. And it's of course worth remembering the reason why it's called the second Qana massacre is there was indeed a first, even more horrific massacre 10 years before that.
Absolutely brilliant, Simon. I don't know if you are a professor, but I'm going to call you one because you make these professorial calls most weeks on the show, and we are all greatly enlightened as a result. But let me, as I've got you on the line, ask you a couple of things that I didn't have time to mention, one of which flows directly from the point you've just made about the two Cana massacres. How is it possible that Robert Kennedy Jr. continues to double down and double down and double down in a level of support for Israel almost unprecedented anywhere in the world today, including Israel? And he is more fanatically an apologist for Israel than any politician on the earth. How is it possible that Kennedy can have those views and repeatedly express them, and yet at the same time have the views that he has expressed on all the other matters, the war, NATO, the CIA, the FBI, and the rest? And doesn't the one appear to contradict the other?
Yes, I think it's a truly puzzling dichotomy, but he's not alone in this. You've obviously seen both Governor DeSantis actually going to Jerusalem and signing not even national or international treaties in Jerusalem, but actually state laws incorporating very extended views of anti-Semitism, not in the capital of Florida, but actually in the disputed capital of Israel. And at the same time, you've had President Trump not only pushing the Abraham Accords, but also embracing the title of King of Israel. And just this week, we've seen 3 emissaries of the Biden administration all going to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, trying and get a huge diplomatic success for President Biden by getting Saudi Arabia to go against its clear wishes of its people to join the Abraham Accords before the general election next year in the US presidential system.
And the second question, Professor, is this. Why is no one talking about what to me looks extraordinarily odd situation of Obama and the dead chef? The pictures that I saw today or yesterday in the British newspapers clearly show wounds, injuries to Obama's fingers. They clearly show a black eye and thus imply some kind of physical event in which President Obama has been involved. At the same time, the chef who died had someone else with him on the paddleboard before he drowned. But nobody is naming who that second person was. What's going on, and why aren't we being told anything, and why aren't the American media in a frenzy to find out?
I think I have an explanation that possibly even you yourself have not considered, and I will obviously specify that I have no proof of this. But if indeed Michelle Obama or Barack Obama were somehow involved in the demise of that employee, then it would certainly cause them second thoughts for Michelle Obama running to be president of the United States. And whilst that may seem outlandish, in the polling that is being done, it's widely held that if President Biden, for whatever reason, decided not to run for a second term, that she is by far, Mrs. Obama, the most popular candidate to replace him on the ballot. So one wonders whether or not they would be able to withstand that level of additional scrutiny if, in fact, they've got some connection with that sad event that befell their employee in Hawaii.
Fabulous. Thank you, Simon in Florida, hereinafter called the professor, whether he is a professor or not. On YouTube, Sarah Kennedy says, I am a Christian and not of your political persuasion, but you speak a lot of sense and are witty and very smart, George. Thank you, Sarah. I love you too for the sake of Christ. Now, coming up is His Excellency Jackson Hinkle from the United States. Why His Excellency? Stay tuned. You're about to find out. Jackson Hinkle after the break. On the line is a Rose in Texas. I was at the beginning of a song on Californication, which is a song. Rose, welcome to the show.
Fan of the show, transgender fan of the show, and I wanted to briefly address your monologue from last week on Californication, because I almost entirely agree with what you said. Trans women athletes taking medals and records, directing children at nightclubs, and even going to elementary schools themselves, not to mention hormone blockers for children as well. The attack on freedom of speech, not only against conservatives, but anyone who doesn't fall in line with the agenda, rainbow flags on NATO military aircraft, which is certainly doing more to cultivate anti-queer sentiment around the world than there already is. All of that makes me sick. So because I don't believe in incest, bestiality, necrophilia, and pedophilia, I'm basically culturally right-wing by today's standards, even though less than 5 years ago, I'd still be left-wing. So in regards to you and everyone else watching who thinks of me and people like me as the villains right now, you should know that I support the most traditional Muslim, Jewish, Abrahamic believers to be as homophobic and transphobic as they want, because guess what? That's freedom of religion, which is a value we claim to have in the West. Now, my religion, I suppose, is I believe I'm a woman, but guess what? Not everyone has to convert to my religion. Otherwise, we basically have a theocracy, only this theocracy is for the ever-evolving LGBTQIA supercalifragilisticexpialidocious club. So that's all I wanted to get out of my system. Thank you.
Well, Rose, if I could put your call in a glass bottle and ship it around the world, I promise you that I would do so. Crystal clear, beautifully expressed, and I wish you every happiness in life. It is exactly what people who are transgender should be saying. And if they were, they would disappoint the liberal zealots who want to use them as a battering ram against the traditional family values of the rest of us. Beautifully expressed, Rose. I'll never forget it.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Is global warming, net zero, a scam? Have your say, yes or no. On my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway. On X, or Twitter as we oldies call it. On the YouTube community poll and on the YouTube stream. Now, I was going to say that Jackson Hinkle comes fresh from an altercation with PiersMorgan, but nobody really emerges fresh from an altercation with PiersMorgan. It was toxic, but Jackson Hinkle took him to the cleaners, as we say in Glasgow. And I'm glad to say, for a celebratory lap of honour, it's the one and only Jackson Hinkle who joins us now. Jackson, what was it like sitting metaphorically in a studio with Rupert Murdoch's mouthpiece, PiersMorgan?
Well, it was quite something. I don't watch a lot of PiersMorgan, I have to admit, but I mean, to start off a conversation about the most pressing geopolitical crisis in the world right now and belittle it by calling the opposing side in this debate, myself, a Putin fanboy, it's just laughable. And I think people saw right through it. The debate on his own YouTube channel, he's got millions of followers, and the vast majority, I think it was by a factor of 4 times, people disliked his video. And it's because if there's one thing worse than I guess hypothetically being a Putin fanboy, as he called me, it's probably to be a Zelensky fanboy.
Well, Piers is Morgan fanboy, and of course he moves according to the wind. You're a young man, so let me educate you in this. He was our #1 ally in the British media against the war on Iraq. He disbelieved everything that the state claimed about the case for invading and occupying Iraq. But he now believes every word of the state case for the war against Russia and the destruction of the Ukrainian people in that inglorious bid. You made you were only on there because they're having to acknowledge that actually in your country and in mine, there's rather a lot of people would prefer Putin as their leader than Joe Biden or Rishi Sunak. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's 100% correct. And well, for you to say that Pierce used to be an ally on subjects such as the Iraq war, I mean, it's just baffling to me because I don't even think he knows what he believes in, and that's why I have to thank people like you who are sincere and honest truth tellers and have been for so long. Because I asked Pierce a simple question. I said, Pierce, if you look at your own Twitter account from February 24th, 2022 onward, there's countless tweets about Ukraine and how he prays for Ukrainians and the atrocities of Putin against the Ukrainian civilians. But if you look before February 24th, 2022, there's not a single tweet about the 15,000 people that were slaughtered in the Donbass, the primarily ethnic Russians killed at behest of NATO by the Ukrainian Nazi government. And in fact, there was one tweet about Zelensky prior to February 24th, 2022, and PiersMorgan was making fun of the comedian with no political experience having risen to the prominence of president of Ukraine. So he was actually making fun of him back then. But it just goes to show that when I asked him the question, why did you not tweet about the Ukrainian deaths prior to February 24, 2022? And he was silent. In fact, he handed the question off to his other Zelensky fanboy he had in the studio with him. I think it proves that so many of these talking heads in the mainstream press, they simply don't believe anything. They are nothing more than, as I just put it, talking heads regurgitating whatever the CIA or the State Department or MI6 have to tell them about matters like Ukraine.
Yes, they live under the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy, but it's particularly sad in Piers's case because he didn't do that in the run-up to the Iraq war. And I counted him as a friend then and for many years thereafter. But as Elvis Costello said, somebody needs to put out the big light. I can't bear to see him this way. But you actually trounced him in the debate because you're a very, very brilliant young man. So much so, you're now an ambassador. And I want to ask you about that. It is quite something that North Korea, for so long shunned by East and West, let's face it, the Chinese and the Russians were nominally allied with North Korea, but they kept it at arm's length. But Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was given a rock star welcome in Pyongyang this week. And it's quite obvious to me, reading the lines and between the lines, that North Korea is about to move quite significantly into, if you like, the new world that is being formed by this UN reconfiguration of the planet. And you are volunteering to be a goodwill ambassador, and good for you being a goodwill ambassador, because why should we be enemies of North Korea?
We shouldn't be. We shouldn't be. And I think many people across the world understand all the good that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un have done for the world. Kim Jong-un is a peace-seeking leader, despite what, the talking heads, again, at CNN and Fox News and MSNBC say about him. They make him sound like some insane, tyrannical, authoritarian, bloodthirsty tyrant that can do nothing right in the world. But when you actually look at videos of Westerners, Australians, UK citizens, anyone who travels to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you see something that's actually exactly opposite to what Hollywood portrays in the movies of North Korea. And you begin to understand that what Donald Trump was trying to do, strike a peace deal with North Korea and begin to normalize relations with North Korea, is actually a good, necessary step, because Russia and China understand that, like Africa, North Korea is a part of this new world, this new formation, this new century that we're living in. And they are people just like us, created by God, and we should be working with them to industrialize the world, create a more peaceful world, and a more hopeful world for all of our nations.
Well, I've been there twice. I haven't met Kim Jong-un, but I've been to North Korea twice, and it is a very fascinating place, unique society. And I hope that you have success in your attempts to foster more goodwill. But I can't show any goodwill towards Joe Biden, I must tell you. As I look at the circus in Washington and see the consequence, I mean, it may have started out just as a grift for the Bidens to make a pile for the future after Joe left the White House as vice president to President Obama. But look what it's turned into. It has corrupted the US Constitution, and it has begotten a war. And now they're trying to arrest Hunter Biden's business partner before he can get to Congress tomorrow to give evidence of the Biden crime family's activities. Will they succeed in that, or will we hear from him tomorrow?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But if recent history is any indication for how this is all going to unfold, let's just take a look at the U.S. judicial system and how the prosecutors in New York and D.C. truly operate. Because Donald Trump has been, given a litany of charges for crimes that I think a bunch of Americans would dispute the validity of. And all the while, Donald Trump has been charged left and right. It seems like every other week he's getting arrested now. We still have none of the Jeffrey Epstein associates who have been held accountable for their crimes. We have SBF of FTX, who looks like he's going to get off the hook for his crimes. And as you just mentioned, they're now trying to do this and protect Hunter Biden and ultimately protect Joe Biden, who is in this fanatical war craze, clamoring for World War III with Russia, just in an effort, I don't know, maybe to protect what he did at this point with Burisma Holdings Group and what they were doing with Hunter Biden with Burisma. And another part of this that a lot of people forget is Hunter Biden was not only involved with Burisma Holdings in Ukraine, but he also was a massive, massive investor for a lot of these U.S.-operated biolabs, former Soviet weapons labs in Ukraine. And he was getting special approval from the DOD while Joe Biden was vice president overseeing U.S.-Ukrainian relations. There's a lot of suspect stuff here. And I think the Burisma payment of $83,000 a month to Hunter Biden is just the tip of the iceberg.
Now, of course, the man who allowed the Bidens to run Ukraine was Obama. Because he looked cool in a tan suit and did a passable Sam Cooke from the stage in Chicago when he was first elected, a lot of people cut him a lot of slack, far more than they ought. But I'm wondering why this week we have a situation Well, the second ObamaChef dies by drowning, Obama and his wife go playing tennis in a ritzy country club not 48 hours after the death by drowning in their garden of their 7-year employee, and Barack is wearing plasters on his hand and sporting a black eye. I'm wondering why that is not the biggest story in America right now. Why?
Well, that's the exact behavior of someone who simply doesn't care about the death of their longtime friend and chef. And it's so in your face at this point. Yes, the question must be asked, why is no one talking about this? And I think the last phone call you had with one of your guests summarizes what so many are thinking, that, at the end of the day, Joe Biden is not polling very high right now, especially when you put him head-to-head against Donald Trump, even in the Rust Belt and the swing states of the United States, which are so critical for winning a presidential election. And I think a lot of people understand that the Democratic Party would love to see someone like Michelle Obama run for office, run for president of the United States to replace Joe Biden, who's sputtering out on his last fumes right now. And, you got to clean up a few untied ends if you're going to run for president of the United States and you have as much dirt on you as I'm sure the Obamas do. So it's not to say that they're guilty, but when you look at these photos that are up by my face on the screen right now, I mean, you have Obama walking around with what appears to be a black eye. He's got presumably cuts on his fingers covered by medical tape. Where did that come from? And why are they so okay with the notion of just flaunting the fact that this looks extremely suspect and that they don't care?
Yeah, it would look extremely suspect if it were Donald Trump that had lost the second of his chefs and was playing golf 2 days later and with a black eye and wearing tape on his hand. Now, finally, Jackson, I'm grateful for your time. If it's not Obama, Mrs. Obama, not sure what her credentials would be, except being married to a former president. I suppose it's a 2-for-1, buy one, get one free, a way of Barack also to be back in the White House. If it's not them, it's going to be this California fellow, isn't it? This Gavin Newsom, about whom most people this side of the pond know very little. Can you enlighten us?
Yeah, he's someone who's got very high presidential ambitions, although I don't think he's going to be polling that high with the American public, given what has happened to California. George, I just moved out of Los Angeles because the situation has become so grim. I'm a California native. I grew up in Orange County, and I moved up to Los Angeles about 2.5 years ago. And it's just insane to see what has happened to our state, the most beautiful state in the union. And now it looks like a video game zombie wasteland. It's horrific. It's so sad. We have 600 to 700,000 homeless Americans. 10% of those are veterans who served our country abroad. Meanwhile, Joe Biden sending $200 billion off to Ukraine, and Gavin Newsom, though he has no say on this because he's a governor of the state of California, I'm sure he applauds and supports all these ambitions of Biden to send more money to Ukraine when his own state is crumbling. Okay. Now, someone who's polling much higher is someone who actually, in the Democratic Party, who rejects the Democratic Party orthodoxy, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I have issues I disagree with him vehemently on, of course, and I'm sure you do as well, like on Israel, for example. But don't you think it's interesting to see someone who is so in opposition to the stated goals of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party, and nearly all Democratic elected officials across the nation polling at 20% in the party? I don't think Gavin Newsom is going to win the Democratic nomination if he does in fact seek it. He's running ads in Florida right now. I've seen those by virtue of his great ideas or his good looks. I think it will be a gerrymandering of the process, just like we saw with Hillary Clinton becoming the nominee back in 2016 when Bernie Sanders was polling so high.
And what can you make of President Biden refusing security detail from the state for Bobby Kennedy when actually the system of giving protection to people running for president only was invented after the murder of Bobby Kennedy's father? Who in the Democratic Party can support refusing protection for somebody called Robert Kennedy?
It seems like a weaponization of our own, our own law enforcement agencies in the United States to try and stifle the success of his main political opponent within the Democratic Party. But then again, is it really that out of character for someone like Joe Biden, who has sicked big tech thugs on any and all opposition in the free and open media independent press? Is it really all that much of something that's out of character for someone like Joe Biden when he's sicking federal prosecutors on his main and number one opposition that's looking like it's going to beat him, that is Donald Trump in the Republican field? No, I don't think it is. And I think, frankly, as grim and dark as it is, Joe Biden would probably love to see Robert F. Kennedy Jr. end up like his own father or like his uncle, JFK, in their very, very sad and tragic demise.
Well, actually, given the record of the Secret Service in protecting Jack Kennedy and the original Robert Kennedy, it's maybe best if Bobby doesn't have recourse to them. Jackson Hinkle, you're a star man. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Is the global warming net zero cult a scam? Yes or no? Have your say. Let me take a quick break. Do you know how many people watch MSNBC? If this was a normal business, it would be out of business long ago. Do you know how many people watch CNN? We are in danger of fixating too much on the liberal hegemony of media outlets with infinitesimally small viewership. This show that you are watching has 10 times the viewership, 10 times the viewership of Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV with its budget of billions. So, let's not lose hope. Let's be our own media. You're right, not everybody watches me, watches those other people that you watch. Well, it's your job, and it's everybody else's job that's watching this and agrees with me this evening. It's your job to tell as many other people as you possibly can what we are all about, how to find us, encourage them, and check up afterwards whether they took your advice, and if they didn't, encourage them all over again. Have you any idea how we would multiply if everybody watching this did that? The best part of 2 million people will watch this program over the next 7 days. If those nearly 2 million spoke to one other person, we'd be 3 million if their advice was taken. And so on and exponentially on, it is possible to go. It's in our hands. Let's do it. I can't do much more than what I'm doing. I need you, the audience, to spread the word.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Some great comments from my supporters on Patreon. If you really want to support me financially for less than the price of a cup of tea per week in an insalubrious cafe, you can do so by supporting me on patreon.com/George Galloway. Peter Moss just has. He says, you're on the right side of history. I've given the occasional shekel or two in the past, but something more regular seems appropriate. Good will win over evil. Amen. Thank you, Peter. Saira Aslam on the poll says, absolute scam. The climate change rhetoric is to scare the masses to give up the little freedoms they have left. And Leslie Hope says, let's see them give up their private jets and wars before they start talking about net zero. Well said, Les. Hill says net zero is a scam. And if there were serious changes to the climate, their plan is not going to be the one for providing a solution. The elites don't think in the interests of ordinary people. And Ben says, will you be doing any live talks anytime soon? I.e. not virtual. I'm based in Farnborough, Hampshire. I'd travel, of course. Ben, you'll be the first to know. Any live talks will be announced here. Tremendous numbers watching the show tonight. Biggest numbers for a very long time. So the poll is now at 15,000 votes, and overwhelmingly people think the global warming net zero cult is just that, a scam. On the line is Prince in Lincoln in England on Niger. Go ahead, Prince. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Gigi. Thank you very much for having me. This is my first time on the show. And also, let me commend you for your powerful monologue. It is indeed the mother of all monologues, and I appreciate your in-depth knowledge and understanding on issues. Quickly on Niger, I think that clearly there's a pathway where Africans must identify themselves and try to begin to think through why this coup have been happening quite very frequently. Since 2020, we've seen almost 6 coups in the continent, and myself being an African, I think that the African governments fundamentally will have to take their time to test the pulse of the population, because it does look like we are not getting any benefit that comes with our association with the West necessarily. And that reminds me of President Putin's admonition of Africa by mentioning the great men like Julius Nyerere and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The truth is, before the coming into play of IMF and World Bank, African governments' foreign policy was significantly towards the East. And at the time, the continent was saddled with little debt. All of a sudden, when we turn into this IMF and the World Bank and these neoliberal economic models, everything went off the route. And African governments, in one way or the other, have been designated HIPIC, highly indebted and poor countries, and also giving some sort of economic model to run which doesn't suit the economy. So clearly, President Putin is only reminding Africans that, look, you have been with us before and you were better off, and now that, it seems that there's a significant change on the global political space, it is important for everybody to recalibrate their economy to be able to see which of the friends can work better for them. And so I think that it is a very great call by President Putin, and most Africans' government must begin to take the step. And also on the shipping of grains to Africa, I think that now that President Putin has promised to give a significant portion of the grains to most African countries, I think that the issues about Odessa and then the grain deal is completely moot, and perhaps that is why you see Ukraine trying to significantly now attack Moscow, because obviously if the argument is these grains are meant for Africa and then Russia is saying, okay, we can give them the grain for free, then it means that there's no deal to talk about any longer. So I think that we are likely to see a very significant change in terms of how things play out in this Ukraine war going forward. And I believe that, yes, African countries must begin to have a rethink in terms of how they recalibrate their foreign policies with the West and that of towards the East.
You are a prince among men, and that was the call of the night, and for many a night too. I think the best African call we've ever had on the mother of all talk shows. Thank you, Prince, for that. On YouTube, George Szamuely Ryder Jacks says, George, you're an amazing person because of the sacrifice you've made to bring the truth to the surface. My name is also George, and it makes me proud to have the same name. I live in Bradford, and I'm a Nigerian. Thank you, George. One of my former parishes, of course. On the line is Erobos, a legend of the mother of all talk shows, from New York. Let's hear from him. Erobos, welcome.
Salubrious evening, Mr. Galloway. To you, family, your friends.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, I was deeply struck. I realized a few days ago I couldn't get the thought out of my mind of when the redoubtable political brother of yours, Chris Williamson, joined the Workers' Party. And I realized that, you know, even though this is a fantastic show, it's not just a show, right? Like, especially like this is a stellar, it's a program. You have provided a place for people to go. And this is what separates you, in my eyes and in my thoughts, from many a podcaster, many of a YouTuber that provide analysis paralysis, fill the people with rage and anger, but they don't provide them a place to go. And, you know, I think that it's a great segue into two relatively short statements I wanted to read from Nick Brania, you know, our national chair at the People's Party. And he said, remember when there was supposed to be the action and organizers? He was responding to some hate, because the opposite, what happened with the Workers' Party, as you would know, the very opposite phenomenon happened with us. And it outrages me. And I'm not able to give details, but I would say this. They were going to organize a general strike. They didn't believe in electoral politics. They said that we should do 80% actions and 20% electoral politics. That we, the People's Party, as a political party, have constantly outdone them and on organizing electorally and actions like force to vote, March for Medicare for All, Occupy Congress, that is, Rage Against the War Machine, etc. We have brought together groundbreaking left-right alliances. We recruited their candidate, Dr. Cornel West, while they just became podcasters. Now, all they do is talk about what other people are doing while we make the news. We make things happen. We're actually changing the course of history. How many little podcasts are there on YouTube? And how many groups are organizing the biggest anti-war rally since Iraq, bridging left and right to the point where we can launch multi-party takedowns of the duopoly and recruiting candidates who break the duopoly. And the final thing from him, that's a personal favorite of mine, where he says, your responsibility to do good is equal to your power to do good. Those with the greatest power to smash the oligarchy and war machine have the greatest moral responsibility to do it. And that's our national organizing chair. And the reason why I mention this is because a lot of people, they talk the talk, but they don't provide a way for people to go. And, you know, and this is the last thing I could say, because as Morpheus told Neo upon the Nebuchadnezzar in my favorite film, The Matrix, time is always against us. But, you know, and we see with the Jacobins, you know, they mobilized and they organized, and they had a place for people to go, right? Even though they had their revolution, they did all of this. What happens when people get so outraged and they go crazy in the streets and they fight the police, they fight the military? They're going to need some place to organize this rage and this anger and put it to good use. And this is how we had the Russian Revolution, the Maoists and people like this. And, I just wanted to congratulate you as a living example that we need a place for people to go. And I know I'm being redundant, but it's very important that people don't understand. We're not going to tweet our way out of this. We're not going to podcast our way out of this. We're not going to yell in the streets and march our way out of this. We did all those things and it hasn't worked. Those are tools, right? We need a place for people to go in order to take control of the system, and by any means necessary does include whatever is left of electoral politics. And I want to thank you and the Workers' Party as a shining example for the world historic progress. And thank you very much.
I'm almost speechless with the power of that call, Erebus, and I thank you deeply for it. Here's a message in from Anthony Lombardi. I've come to know so many stimulating thoughts from George's guests. I end up following many of them on their own platforms. Also, guests like Erebus give interesting insights. It's working, Erebus. Here is a call from Nigeria about Niger. It is from Ijeli. Go ahead, caller. Thank you for ringing.
Good evening, Mr. George, and I'm happy to be here this wonderful evening. I want to thank you in a special way because over here in West Africa, you don't know the number of followers you have. And I thank you for bringing up this Niger issue. What's happening in Niger? How is it different from what Sisi and his friends did in Egypt? But in Egypt, they love the military takeover of power. In Niger, they now hate it. Right now, my own president, the newly elected President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, is now talking about sanctions, and I'm hearing in some quarters about a military operation in Niger. I'm from Nigeria. If you know, we have a lot of security challenges from north to south. You have all manner of problems. All these Western armed group or militants, they call ISIS, they call them Islamic terrorists, but we know where their guns are coming from and the ones funding them. We've not even dealt with them, and they are talking about sending troops to Niger. And it takes me to another question, which is, are they actually going to use Africans or are they going to activate AFRICOM? Because if you look at AFRICOM and all their bases where they are situated, 100% where you have mineral resources, 100% where you have all these so-called terrorists terrorizing the people, 100% where you have Western-backed puppet regimes. And as it stands, we don't know what's going to happen, but I hate the fact that my own people are not even seeing what is happening in Niger. We are being sucked into the same vortex like in Libya. During Libya invasions and the bombing campaigns of Libya, as much as I thought I supported it. Why? Because I bought into all the Western media lies. And a lot of Nigerians and a lot of Africans are not seeing this for what it really is. If they actually love Africa, they should let Niger handle the problem of Niger. And I don't know why our own people are sticking our noses into where they don't belong. ECOWAS shouldn't be
exactly so. As I said earlier, I know nothing about the new leaders of Niger. All I know is nobody came out to defend the overthrown government on the streets of Niger. They have supporters, but they're unfortunately in France, unfortunately in Washington. Nobody came out to defend the corrupt regime that was overthrown. In fact, there were thousands on the streets supporting the coup in Niger. And the leading opposition party in Niger is also supporting the coup. So I don't know who's who, what's what in Niger. It's one of the places in the world that I know very little about. But I know this: a regime whose supporters are only to be found in Washington and Paris are almost certainly not a regime worth the blood of Nigerian soldiers going in to fight to reinstate a thief from the corrupt puppet regime as was. Thank you for the call. Email from Kevin. Good evening, George. I'd like to point out about global warming. As we all know, there are tanks, etc., burning in the forests in Ukraine, but their forests are not burning down. And the fact that there are no wildfires in Russia, they only burn down houses and not trees. Shlomo is a wise man in Virginia in the US on net zero. Let's hear from him. Shlomo, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, George, very much. As somebody who agrees with you 99.9% with everything you say, I'm puzzled about the global warming. Your understanding and new solutions for the climate change, if any, I would really appreciate it, so I can answer better to your question about the net zero. Thank you.
All I'm campaigning for is a referendum so that we can have the national debate that we never had. Theresa May signed us into an ironclad commitment of net zero by 2050 with all of its consequences without a single vote being cast. Not in the country and not even in Parliament, because there was the same kind of uni-party consensus over net zero as there was about COVID and lockdown and about the vaccination and as there is about the Ukraine war. And I'm old enough to know that when the Houses of Parliament are unanimous, they are almost always unanimously wrong. So you don't have to agree with me on whether net zero 2050 is a laudable, achievable, and worthwhile goal. You don't have to. You just have to agree with me that the people need to have a vote on it. And they need to have a vote on it after a national, and if it spreads, an international debate. Because there has been none. Because people who, like me, take a different point of view are censored, silenced, deplatformed. We're told that our point of view must not even be heard on the question of climate. I believe it's a scam. I believe it's a con. And guess what? Out of 15,625 people who voted on this so far, the vast majority of those who voted have agreed with me. So given the hour, Shlomo, we're not going to resolve this issue now, but I hope that as a Democrat, with a small d, you'll support my campaign, which is now being joined by people of left, right, and center, to have a net zero referendum. I hope you'll support that. Shlomo, last word to you.
Yes, I will support it. Thank you.
Good. Excellent. Thank you for that. On YouTube, Asaf Min says, "Hi, George. Hope you're well. I hope you can get Simon in Florida as a guest on your show, please." Very much so. I do hope that our editor will take note of that. Brian Holden says, "In America, the rich are called wealth creators, but in Russia, they are called oligarchs." Very good. One man's oligarch is another man's wealth creator. Lance is another wise man. He's in Canada. Wants to talk about Twitter, or is it X? I don't know, Lance. Go ahead.
I actually think the Twitter and X and the net zero thing are distantly related. But my thought on this whole Twitter thing, and it has been for a while, is that we've kind of marketed Elon Musk as a bit of a messiah, a science messiah and political messiah. And then at some point, he showed that he was for free speech, and they were very clearly showing the World Economic Forum types saying, Elon Musk is getting carried away with this free speech thing. And now we have World Economic Forum people taking over Twitter. And the plan, at least as far as I understand for this X, is to take over everything, like a central bank digital currency, a payment system, some sort of a blockchain, you name it. So I believe that that's been sort of a plan all along to captivate us with this whole Tesla future, and then move us under that umbrella, basically to make us go willingly. That's has been my take on this whole thing all along. It's but there's an old saying.
Look, you might, yeah. No, go ahead, Lance.
There's an old saying: never attribute to conspiracy what you can contribute to stupidity. So we will see. But
I don't think he's a stupid man. I don't know.
I don't think so either. But that's.
I don't.
But I'm not talking.
I don't know.
Him.
Yeah, I don't know Musk, and I'm suing him in the courts in Dublin, a case which is ongoing for his fake labeling of me, or rather refusal to remove the fake labeling of me, undoubtedly at the behest of an agency, either in Washington or in London. He refused to remove a false and defamatory label, which hundreds of millions of people saw. Hundreds of millions. You'd be astounded. My lawyers counted them all up. The number of people who saw that fake and damaging mislabeling of me. So I'm suing him. I don't know him. On the other hand, this show is coming to you via Starlink, at least on my end. And I'm a big user of Twitter. I even pay him money for a blue tick, and I have almost 500,000 followers on it. And although I'm still censored and algorithmically suppressed, they have been unable to arrest the rise and rise and rise, not just of my number of followers, but the traction that my best tweets get, which are now very rarely less than 6 figures, and now 500,000, even 750,000, quite regularly. So it's a very important platform for me, and it allows me to reach more people at the touch of a button than PiersMorgan will ever reach through the portals of Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV. So I'm not going to rubbish him, and neither am I going to elevate him. He's no Messiah to me. There's only one Messiah for me, and that's not Elon Musk. So I take people as I find them. I think he's done a good job at Twitter. I have no idea why he would change it to X. What are you supposed to say? I X'd about this just the other day. But maybe I'm just old-fashioned. It'll always be Twitter and tweeting to me. I don't know about you. An email from Gilbert. George, great show as usual. My question to you is this. I've heard or read somewhere that due to the amount of criminal accusations against the Biden crime family, Biden is now doubling down in starting a war with Russia or China in order to cancel any elections, and also declare martial law in order to prevent any criminal interventions against him. After all, you can't arrest a sitting president when your country is at war. Well, I've got to tell you, I don't think that will happen. I doubt that it could happen. I doubt that it would be legal, that the Supreme Court would allow that to happen. But what do I know? Chuck in San Diego might know. He's up next on the Biden crime family. Go ahead, Chuck.
Good evening, George. Great show. Guests and callers as always. Joe Biden and Hunter Biden are not an anomaly. Every American city practically, and I dare say around the world, has some combination of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. A child who could do no wrong, who actually could never do any right, who was always protected by the parent. In my neighborhood where I grew up, a neighbor was exactly the same. His son started off tying cherry bombs to cat's tails and ended up as a murderer. But every step along the way where they could have intervened and done something to stop them, the parents stepped in and protected them. Hunter Biden is no different than a lot of these people around the country and around the world. And the final thing is, JFK stated, ask not what your country could do for you, ask what you could do for your country. Bush, the second, said, my country, right or wrong. And Obama basically is saying, I can do whatever I want to do and get away with it. America is no longer the moral leader of the world. It is the leading terrorist, the leading seller of death weapons. And Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland grew up playing Risk, and now they are taking the world to task and leading us to a nuclear Armageddon. Thank you again for all you do.
Yeah, risking Armageddon. Great call, a brilliant call, Chuck, in San Diego. Andy is in my own country of Scotland, in Edinburgh. Let's hear from him. Andy, welcome to the show.
Hi, George. Great fan. Great to watch you. I just wanted to make a very simple point about the size of our armed forces. If you go back to 1953, we had around 550,000 people in the army. Admittedly, we were coming back off the Second World War, but we had a population at that time of about 50 million. Today, we've got just under 80,000. I think we've got about 4,000 Gurkhas, about 77,000 regular members of the army, yet we've got a population of 67 million. So the decline of our armed forces relative to our population growth is staggering. And how we think we can go and support Ukraine with military personnel on the front line, bearing in mind we could probably only muster about 7,000 of that 70,000 that could go and fight on the front line. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about Ben Wallace, the Conservatives, the whole machine that rides high on Britain as great, and we're sort of some superpower. And frankly speaking, we haven't got the people to back it up.
What a great call, Andy, in Edinburgh. Britannia once ruled the waves, now it just waves the rules. The rules of law, international law. And it is maddening to see what militarily is a puny little runt shaking its fist at the world, threatening people over and over again, joining in invasions which are only possible because of the United States, running after the United States like the runt that runs around with the school bully, hoping to pick up some of the small change from the pockets of those the bully hangs upside down. It's maddening indeed. And I have, of course, had many decades of being maddened by that. None of that is to imply any disrespect to any serving member of the armed forces. I was myself a boy soldier in the Army Cadet Force, Royal Artillery Battery 2, and also for a few weeks a putative member of the Royal Marine Commandos. When I was 16, I seriously thought about that. So I have no hatred or animus towards any of the 70,000 to whom you refer. But the truth is, we have a minuscule army, poorly equipped. Don't get me started on the Challenger 3 and the Challenger 2 that we sent with such fanfare to Ukraine cannot be used in dangerous areas. Where the not dangerous areas in Ukraine are, perhaps they should let us know, then everyone can take shelter there. The entire armed forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force, could comfortably fit into Villa Park, Birmingham. I mention Villa Park because many people will not be that familiar with Villa Park. It is not a massive stadium. It is a medium-sized big stadium. And our entire Army, Navy, and Air Force could fit in it. And of course, our aircraft carriers, our battleships. I speak as one who used to represent a Royal Naval warship building shipyard, Yarrows on the Clyde. It was my job to agitate for Type 21 frigates, Type 23 frigates to be allocated to that shipyard. And I did, because that was my duty. The Navy is shrunk to the point of almost inoperability. And yet we're sending what vessels we have to the South China Sea, while thousands of people are coming across illegally in rubber dinghies across our own waters. None of our Navy is in the English Channel. All of it is more likely to be found in the Straits of Taiwan. Go figure on that. It is maddening. And the pygmy Ben Wallace is quite fittingly the Secretary of State for Defense, a little man in charge of a little army. The only thing we have is nuclear weapons. The thing that we deny countries like Iran from having. Only us and our few friends are allowed to have nuclear weapons. But of course, whilst nuclear weapons, British possession of, is a potentially very powerful thing indeed, it would mean the end of the existence of Britain. Because of course, as soon as we'd fired our 5, the Russians and the Chinese would fire 500. And Britain would be a carbonized pile of ash. Not much of a defensive weapon, that one. Andy, brilliant call. I'm only clearing you off now because we've got another legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol on Sinead O'Connor. Norma, welcome.
I wrote it out actually because there were several things I wanted to just say. The funny thing is, the president of Burkina Faso, as you said no one should pity a slave who does not rebel. Now, this is a tribute to Sinead O'Connor, which is similar to that. I mean, she died this week, and it was sad. She was complicated, and she had a compelling voice, and she didn't wish to conform, and she was maligned by the principles she gave in the USA. But she did, this is my view anyway, she did lay the pathway by stating and singing her principles and against the abuse of the Catholic Church, the right of abortion, gay marriage in Ireland, and she had the guts to say something that spoke out against the people. And I think, I know she's died, but that we should congratulate her for that, really, don't you think?
Well, I disagree with her on many of those things.
Yeah, I do a little
I
bit
knew
on
her
one or
personally.
two.
I knew her personally for a short time, a long time ago. She was a very beautiful and sensitive soul, a wonderful artist. She once sang, "Nothing compares to you." To me, she didn't mean it that she was saying nothing compared to me, but she sang it personally in my presence. She was a a very, very wonderful musician, artist, singer, and may God have mercy upon her and rest her soul in a way that her life was never really rested. But you're right to say that the cant and hypocrisy of many of those rushing to pay tribute to her now that she is dead, I would never have crossed the road to come to her side or her assistance or to give her work or to help facilitate her art. None of them would have. And it's very difficult to see hypocrisy in action. And the hypocrisy around Sinead O'Connor's death has been off the scale. Sinead, rest in peace, nothing compared to you at your very, very best. 15,779 people voted in the poll. Not bad, but 93% on Telegram considered the net zero a scam. 86% on Twitter considered it a scam. 91% on the YouTube community poll considered it a scam, and 90% on the YouTube stream. That tells me I'm onto something, that my party is onto something. Our demand for a net zero referendum is being piloted by one of our members, His Excellency Peter Ford, former British ambassador. He's doing the intellectual legwork on it. He's heading up that campaign for us, and he's the ideal man to do it. We already have the support of the Reclaim Party, and we hope as weeks go on that we'll get the support of many parties and ultimately the governing party, who must want to stop the bus and get off, because 2050 is just round the corner. And the price of net zero for Britain, which produces 0.04% of carbon emissions in the world, cannot be paid. You know the feeling when you see a bill or you get a price quoted at you and you feel bad. It's agonizing. If I pay that, I'll have to give up that and so on. No. This is a bill that literally cannot be paid by the British people, who've already been placed over a barrel by the energy price rises over this last 12 months. And the obscene profits being made by British Gas, obscene levels of profits. Whilst people are going cold, and 12 weeks from now will be cold again in the British winter time, we cannot afford to stop exploiting our oil and gas fields. We cannot afford to abandon nuclear power. We cannot afford not to have a balanced energy policy with all kinds of tributaries supplying energy to our people. We certainly can never re-industrialize our country on a net zero 2050 prospectus. And if we do not re-industrialize, what will we be? Who will we be? What kind of country could we possibly be if we do not retool, re-energize, and re-industrialize ourselves again? And if net zero was so worthy an objective, why do they keep their private jets whilst trying to tell us we cannot drive our cars except by paying through the nose in ULEZ, on the streets of London, now even outer London? How come you can't drive your car in outer London, but the oligarchs and the politicians can fly around in private jets? It's a bit like being told You can't go and visit your old mother, but the Prime Minister is having a party with his aides in Downing Street. The hypocrisy is off the scale. And this catastrophism, this apocalyptic vision which they paint, is simply not believable. John Kerry, who flies around in a private jet everywhere he goes, said in 2009 that in 5 years we will have the very first ever ice-free Arctic. It was a lie, or a prediction that not only didn't come true, but will never come true, has never come true. They're always telling us that if we don't give up this, if we don't pay this price, the consequence will be this catastrophe, this apocalypse. And I don't believe it. You may believe it, in which case let's have a referendum and compare your beliefs with mine. What we cannot do is go down quietly into that good night without even a proper two-sided debate on these questions and a democratic vote in a net zero referendum. These were my final thoughts. I've unfortunately overrun. It's 21:06 UK time. Please forgive me if it was in any way tedious. It's been a wonderful show, I think, and I'm very glad that you kept me company through it. Well over 1 million people, again, 1.7 million people watched the mother of all talk shows in the last 7 days, but I'm still dying to get to that 2 million number again. You feel me? So help me. Help me by bringing another one listener. It's not beyond you, you know. If every one of you who enjoyed it, well, frankly, I'll be at 3 million, not 2 million. Thanks very much indeed for your time. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. And I wish you all a very pleasant night.